This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint on empires and minorities during the post-classical period. Governance. So the compelling question is how to govern or manage a large and diverse population. And land-based empires were really facing a difficult time with this issue. The reason why is, remember, land-based empires were organizations that had combined together villages and city-states, especially when in the area that we call the Middle East or Central Asia. That meant there were a number of different languages, ethnicities, and religions. And when I say that, I mean literally hundreds of ethnicities, languages, and religions, if not thousands of these existed. So the big question was, what type of system could be organized to give different groups that kind of assimilation and to be done in an efficient way and with growth? So some of the ways that this was done. First of all, one of the patterns that we see is a hierarchy, a clear order of authority that created stability and roles for different people. Another thing that we would see is religious advisors who provided a justification for the political and social order that existed. Classes, where groups of people were given both common economic and social roles. And be careful with that. Class actually has numerous different definitions. It's not just a matter of how much income or wealth you have. Class also has to do with your social status, your educational status, the position you have within society, whether or not you own land, or if you own what's called the means of production. Classes actually have numerous different parts to them. And last up, one of the classic roles that was done at this time was family systems, which we see commonly popping up almost all over the world during post-classical systems, just with different names. Local areas were run by families, and when I say families, I don't mean the nuclear family that we see today, but rather large extended kinships of families in which people who were indirectly related to each other would be led by some type of father figure. Foreign relations. Empires expanded at the time. They conquered local civilizations for resources, labor, and power, but the typical relationship tended to be a tributary relationship, in which local populations would be granted the freedom to run their own type of governance, their own type of political system, their own type of religious system and culture if they sent taxes back to the central empire. Taxes were based upon produce. They were not income. So what do I mean by that? So today we tax income. We tax people's wealth. We tax people's salaries at the end of the year. That was not the way taxes were done back during the post-classical age. Taxes were done based upon produces. And what I mean by that is that every single year, local areas would send in products, especially agricultural products, that would then be sold by the Central Empire to make money for the empire to build up their army. Sometimes taxes were also done with humans for sacrifice. This was primarily done in the Aztec and the Incan region. This maintained both trade and what are known as political spheres of influence. So what do I mean by that? Political sphere of influence is going to be very important throughout this class, and the idea is this, is that you have some kind of dominating group that has cultural, political, and economic influence over a region. So like, for example, China has influence over the Southeast Asian region. India has influence over the Central Asian region. Several Middle Eastern empires have influence over the entire Middle East. The three post-classical dynasties that we want to remember for the Chinese time period are the Sui, the Tang, and the Song. The Chinese dynasties in the post-classical period expanded out into areas like Tibet, Vietnam, Korea, and Manchuria. They established tributary relationships with these conquered groups, and they maintained control through the spread of Chinese Confucianism in the civil service exam. In fact, what was really important about how they would do something like this is that even though the areas resented having been conquered by the Chinese, and sometimes even kicked the Chinese out, they still adopted most of the Chinese culture, especially Chinese Confucianist systems and the civil service exam, and they would even adopt much of the Chinese language. The Chinese so-called Middle Kingdom was seen as civilized both by China and many of the conquered upper classes of these different regions, especially, for example, in Korea and Vietnam. Neoconfucianism. Now, there was a problem with this expansion, and the problem had to do with cultural identity. Expansion meant that there had to be more trade routes. And remember, according to Confucianism, the primary way you wanted to do economics was through farming. And the reason for that was so that you would have good, strong family relationships. Now, what starts to happen if we start to have expansion in trade? Well, all of a sudden now, family starts to break down to more self-interested types of organizations. And so that really undermines Confucianism. And this was happening both between China and other countries and within China. As China began to expand more and more, it had to create trade canal connections. And they did that through a massive new, what was called the Grand Canal, which connected northern China to the south. This led to port cities and a new middle class, but that really caused a new problem. As there was this new middle class that was growing up in these port cities, the problem came up, how do you deal with these self-interested merchants? And so one of the ways that they tried to solve this to create a new sense of filial piety was to create something called Neoconfucianism. Neoconfucianism combined together family piety with Buddhism's belief in an afterlife. And so this started to provide rewards and punishments for people. The merchant middle class could be a merchant middle class, but they still had to look to the afterlife, and in doing so, they had to look to the common good, not just their own individual interest. A second problem with expansion were steppe invaders. So throughout this entire time period, and throughout most of Chinese history, the problem is as they expand outwards, they come into contact with that steppe region that's just north of China. And the primary group at this time period was a group of people called the Jurchens. The Jurchens first allied with the Song dynasty in order to fend off some of the other steppe invaders, but then they attacked the Song dynasty and pushed the Song dynasty way down into the south. The Jurchens were eventually assumed into the Song population, but they were able to maintain political governance over the Song dynasty, and over time, the Chinese became more Jurchen in their original types of culture, and we just saw an assimilation together of the culture of the steppe region and the Chinese region. So out in the Middle East, we're going to see three what are called gunpowder empires during this time period. And just as in China, one of the big problems for these three gunpowder empires is how to deal with numerous different ethnic groups as they are expanding outwards. The Ottomans were the largest of all the Muslim empires. They conquered lands from Iran all the way out to northern Africa. So in doing that, they then had massive new amounts of populations, ethnicities, religions and languages. So how did they manage to organize all these people? Well, they did it through a variety of ways of basically buying out, or what we call co-opting, people into the government. So one way they did this was through something called the Janissary Corps. The Janissary Corps kidnapped boys from local Christian and Jewish communities and brought them to the capital in Istanbul. They then gave these boys a position in the Islamic military, and the Janissary Corps would then advise the Sultan, who was the sort of like king over the entire empire. There was also the Devshirme. The Devshirme is the Sultan's harem. So this is where the Sultan would go, and there would be numerous kidnapped girls from local Christian and Jewish communities and Muslim communities placed into the Sultan's harem. Now, for a long time, people had a stereotype of this harem, and this became sort of the stereotype of the Ottoman Empire, that the Devshirme was a place where sexual practices were done in a way that was very foreign and exotic and very much against Western norms. But there's a strange story about this. There was once a Catholic priest who went to go visit the Ottoman Empire, and he was taken to the Devshirme, which was a little strange because usually nobody was allowed to go there except for the Sultan. And after he went there, he came out and he said that actually what the Devshirme looked like was, his closest analogy to him, was like a nunnery back in Europe. Now, what did he mean by this? Well, obviously, nuns did not have sexual relationships with anybody back in Europe. So how could there be any kind of similarity here? Well, it was true that the Sultan would have sexual relations with numerous different women inside of the Devshirme, but he only did that for reproductive purposes. It really wasn't what the Western stereotype was that the Sultan was just using these women for his sexual pleasures. Rather, the women in the Devshirme were only used in order to produce children. And then by producing children, nobody really knew where these children were coming from. And nobody outside knew whether or not the new sultan was a Christian sultan, a Jewish sultan, or a Muslim sultan. Now, that might seem strange. Obviously, in the end, the sultan would always be Muslim. But nobody knew the blood background of the sultan. And so what the Devshirme did was it created that sort of confusion. And nobody wanted to attack the sultan because they feared that they might be attacking one of their own. As for women, the priest noticed as he went through the Devshirme that most of the time women's practices inside of the Devshirme were making products for sale, learning how to read, especially the Quran, and learning how to be educated. And so while the Devshirme definitely was by no means perfect according to our standards, the Devshirme in many ways uplifted women and gave them a higher status within the Islamic Empire. And then there were what are called millets. Millets were local Christian and Jewish communities that were allowed to practice their own religious and political systems as long as they eventually gave ultimate authority back to the Sultan. So we've seen this practice before. The idea is to maintain and allow for local practices of religion while still maintaining ultimate authority back in Istanbul. And this created a peace between the centralized government and the local governments. So the second major empire is the Safavids, and the Safavids were a small Muslim empire in Iraq. They were landlocked and they lacked the naval power in order to counter their enemy, the Sunni Ottomans. So the Muslim empire in Iraq was Shiite, and this goes back to that divide between Shiites and Sunnis. And you'll notice here that the Safavids actually were extremely small in contrast to the Ottomans, yet they were able to maintain their empire against the Ottomans. They just didn't expand out very far. Well, how did they do this? Well, the main person to do it was their Shah. So their sort of king was not called the Sultan, he was called Shah, and the main one was Shah Abbas. And he forced the Shiite faith onto the national identity, on everybody, including another type of Muslim minority called the Sufis. He organized all of these people together under the Shiite faith and gave them sort of a national identity. Then on top of that, Abbas brought in foreign advisors. Well, why would he do something like this? Well, he did it in order to force the Shiite nobles to have to compete for influence with Abbas, and that made sure that there was never one group that would have dominance over the Safavid Empire. So this national identity and this competition at the top ended up creating a pretty strong Shiite dynasty that was able to check and balance off the Sunni Ottomans. The last major gunpowder empire is the Mughals, and the Mughals were located within India. Now, India is extremely large, what is known as a subcontinent, and of course the reason why it's called a subcontinent is that it's a very large landmass. It's not quite as large as a continent, but it's so large that it contains so many areas it's very difficult to govern. And the northern part of India is even more difficult to govern. Up at the northern part of India, we have the Himalayan mountains, we have the Ganges Desert, the Ganges River, we have the Thar Desert. We have numerous areas that are just so difficult to get to because of the terrain. And on top of that, it's right in the area of where the Silk Roads pass by. So you have numerous different people constantly coming through here. And eventually what happens is that the northern part of India gets conquered by the Muslims. Now, when the Muslims conquer it, they still have to deal with the different religions that exist there. So you have the Hindu religion and the Muslim religion up in the north, and in the south there are local animist traditions going back to the ancient days of the Harappan dynasties. So during this time period, Akbar the Great is the main Mughal emperor that we want to remember. He tried to deal with all this conflict by creating something called the divine faith, which blended together the underlying common beliefs of all the religions. So, for example, he allowed the Hindus and the Muslim temples to be opened up, and he allowed for advisors from all these groups in his central court. About 2 generations later, though, his grandson, Aurangzeb, who is a Muslim, ends all of this and sees this as impure to Islam and starts to crack down on the Hindus. And this eventually leads into a civil war, which is going to last for over 100 years. And by the end of that civil war, Britain will be able to use that in order to come in and take over India. So what are some of the big conclusions that we should consider off of this? Are expansive empires something that can be maintained, or are they internally self-destructive? When we take a look at things like China, we see that as they expanded outwards, they undermined their own culture, they brought in these steppe regions as they kind of cross over the toes on them. Or take a look at the gunpowder empires. As the gunpowder empires expanded outwards, did they become too expansive? Did they end up unable to resolve the different cultural conflicts? Did land empires discover that the principle of federalism or local rule sharing worked? You'll notice here that just like we have a principle of what's called federalism, in which there's a central government and we share power with local powers, seems to go way back in world history. While it's true that federalism is something that was created much more in America, the principle behind it, the idea of local rule sharing, goes way back to all these empires. And this was nothing new when the Americans came across it. It was something that had been tried by land-based empires for quite some time. And then last up, the big question, what is the best way that we can manage minority groups? Do we do this through forced domination? In other words, you go in and you just conquer and you force people into your culture, your politics, your economics. Is it through assimilation, sort of like the Jurchens, where you just take over the group of people and you assimilate their culture in? Or is it due to a form of tolerance or blending? Now, the last one probably sounds really good to us because that's kind of what we believe here in America, but even that has its downside if you really think about it. I mean, take a look at what happened in the Mughal Empire. When you try to tolerate and blend together together different groups, you anger the extremes of groups, and they start to fight against each other because they feel that it's caused impurity.